June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. A pencil quivered faintly in the hand of Unificia Vera Burkhardt as he scrawled lines into a diary he kept carefully hidden, a private record of thoughts so dangerous that, had they been uncovered by his own officers, he would have faced harsh punishment or solitary confinement. He wrote with a growing sense of disbelief, convinced that the Americans could not possibly be telling the truth. No nation, he thought, could maintain such prosperity while fighting wars on two different fronts. But what his eyes had just witnessed, through the window of the train, defied everything that 3 relentless years of Nazi propaganda had drilled into him and his comrades. Across the Texas landscape, deep into the night at 10 o'clock, lights burned everywhere. Every farmhouse glowed, every corner was brightened, every shop illuminated. The land seemed covered in a sprawling web of electricity, like a constellation stretching endlessly over the plains. In Germany, by contrast, blackout rules had cast the Reich into darkness since 1940, leaving cities and villages shrouded in fear and shadow. Even in the years before the conflict began, rural electrification had barely touched a fifth of German farms, leaving most of the countryside in gloom. Yet here, in the very nation that Nazi leaders had labeled as decadent, fractured, and on the verge of collapse, energy flowed as naturally as water, lighting the land as if war had not touched it at all. From the train stepped 1,850 men of Irwin, RML's Africa Corps, veterans of the desert battles, men accustomed to dust, deprivation, and retreat. But the transport that had carried them was not the cramped cattle cars or suffocating freight wagons they had expected, but smooth Pullman coaches, complete with padded seats, dining compartments, and even sleeping berths. To their astonishment, the entire community of Mexia had gathered to witness the event, filling the streets with faces full of curiosity, amazement, and even sympathy. The people looked upon them not with hatred, but with interest, as if observing something historic unfold. What the soldiers themselves could not yet realize was that this seemingly ordinary arrival would ignite one of the most profound psychological upheavals of the modern age, a slow but unrelenting dismantling of the very ideology that had once defined their existence. This collapse would not come through arguments, lectures, or propaganda, but through the undeniable force of American productivity and organization. The evidence of victory was not in battlefield maneuvers or military maps, but in the sheer statistics of industry, in the factories that produced endlessly, and in the abundance of resources that would soon shatter every belief they had carried about their enemies, their country, and their cause. That collapse had already begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, where the African campaign met its end. General Jürgen von Arnim, who had taken command after Rommel, surrendered along with a staggering number of troops, estimates ranging from 250,000 to nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The figures shifted for days as scattered and isolated units laid down their arms one after another. These were not inexperienced conscripts, but the most hardened desert veterans, soldiers who had once driven the British forces all the way back to the gates of Egypt, men whose skill had earned even Montgomery's reluctant respect. Now they were prisoners, marched into captivity. Among them was Headman Friedrich Radke, bearer of the Iron Cross First Class, survivor of the campaign in France, twice wounded in the North African desert, and a man whose personal writings, discovered long after the war in the National Archives, would later become a priceless key for historians seeking to understand the psychological journey that German prisoners endured under American control. That journey began not in Texas, but at the Algerian port of Oruran, where Radke and nearly 30,000 other captured men were held in improvised camps while waiting for transport ships. Even there, before they had left African soil, the first cracks began to appear in the walls of certainty that Nazi indoctrination had built within them. The Americans managed the overwhelming numbers with a level of precision and order that startled the captives. Thousands of prisoners were processed each day with such methodical accuracy that it surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had managed even during its height of power. Each prisoner was photographed and issued identification cards. Every man was given a medical examination and the necessary inoculations. And perhaps most remarkable of all, their rights under the Geneva Convention were clearly explained to them in flawless German by American officers who had been trained specifically for that role. The efficiency seemed mechanical, but it carried a human touch that none of them had expected. The greatest shock, however, came when the prisoners were fed. Oberreiter Hans Müller of the 21st Panzer Division, captured alongside many of his comrades, wrote to his mother months later from captivity. He described that while they had waited in the cages at Oruren, expecting the worst, the Americans had given them food unlike anything they had tasted for months in the desert. They received white bread, something rare and precious in wartime. Europe, along with real coffee and portions of meat served twice daily. At first, they had dismissed it all as a trick, believing the Americans were only trying to impress them, a calculated gesture of propaganda. Only later did they learn, with a mixture of disbelief and resignation, that this was nothing more than the standard diet of the U.S. Army. Then came the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic, vessels that themselves embodied the immense scale of American industry. The Liberty ships, practical, sturdy, and mass-produced, were unlike anything the Germans could imagine. One in particular, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been constructed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. The record was so unbelievable that, had the Germans known of it at the time, they would have dismissed it outright as a fabrication. But this was no exaggeration. At the height of production, the United States was launching 3 of these cargo giants every single day. They carried supplies to Europe in unending streams, and when returning they no longer sailed empty, but instead transported thousands upon thousands of prisoners of war, sometimes as many as 30,000 in a single month during the summer of 1943. The voyage across the Atlantic lasted 2 weeks, and for many prisoners it marked the second stage of their psychological unraveling. The ships themselves seemed symbols of a vast machine that no force could possibly resist. Feld Kurt Zimmermann, of the 90th Light Division, recorded his thoughts carefully during that journey. Letters that he sent home after his eventual repatriation, providing later generations with a vivid window into the slow but steady dismantling of certainty in the minds of men who had once believed their Reich to be invincible. He noted that the crew tossed out more scraps each day than his whole company had been given in a week. Sailors casually discarded half-eaten steaks, entire loaves, and gallons of milk gone past their prime. Zimmermann recorded that this waste was not meant as an insult, but simply reflected a supply that never seemed to run out. The ships themselves became inadvertent lessons in American capacity. The men discovered their transport was one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the conflict, each requiring about 250,000 individual parts sourced from factories in 32 states. Guards who chatted with the prisoners explained that the engines came from 3 different plants, each turning out 900 horsepower cylinders, later assembled at ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, scion of a Prussian family with generations of service, would later recall watching a radar array sweep above the ship's bridge and realizing that a technology he had imagined rare and secret was standard equipment even on a cargo vessel. It was the moment he suspected Germany had already lost the war. On August 2, 1943, the site of Norfolk Naval Base obliterated whatever propaganda remained about American weakness. The installation sprawled over some 4,300 acres, its piers running for miles, cranes unloading and loading dozens of ships at once. In a single day, that port moved more tonnage than the Germans managed out of Hamburg in a week. A factory worker named Johann Weber counted 47 cargo ships being handled at varying stages and noted how each crane lifted loads that in Germany would have required teams of men and horses. Here the work ran on electric power, smooth and continuous, with none of the coal smoke that choked their own industrial centers. The prisoners were then marched toward trains and past lots full of private automobiles, hundreds owned by dockhands and laborers. Back in Germany, cars were largely the province of the affluent and party hierarchy, the legendary Volkswagen. N had been promised since 1934, but fewer than 1,000 had reached civilians. Here, ordinary workers drove themselves to shifts, and the trains were no grim freight wagons but proper passenger coaches, Pullman cars with cushioned seats that folded into bunks, dining cars set with white cloths and silverware, observation cars with sweeping windows. Hedman Radke later wrote that they boarded like tourists, not prisoners. The American Guard seemed almost embarrassed by the luxury. One sergeant even apologized that the air conditioning in their coach was malfunctioning. Air conditioning, a comfort the captives had assumed existed only in Hitler's own train. That 3-day ride from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma wrecked Nazi certainties perhaps more thoroughly than any battlefield loss. As the locomotives rolled through Virginia, the men pressed to the windows and watched a country that should not have existed according to everything they had been taught. Small towns such as Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro shone with lights. Shopfronts glowed, electric signs flashed, and houses burned with light in many rooms. Scenes that, to a German conditioned by blackout rules and scarce rural electrification, were almost unbelievable. They passed factories running night shifts, radiating light, and parking lots that were full even at midnight. An amateur writer named Mayer, whose father had been a Nazi block leader in Hamburg, later penned in a letter found in 1987 that they had moved through dozens of cities that first night and each one had more electricity than the whole of Hamburg. When American guards told them this was normal, that most U.S. towns had been wired since the 1920s, the prisoners accused them of lying. The guards only shrugged and said the men would see for themselves. At Roanoke, Virginia, a stop for water and coal demonstrated the gap in efficiency. American railway crews completed in 30 minutes tasks that would have taken 2 hours back home, using automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems. Every stage of the operation displayed clear technological superiority. Even more disquieting was the casual prosperity of the workers. Boots of leather that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' pay, men drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles and tossing the empties into bins without a second thought. Cigarettes, stubbed out, half-smoked. Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, estimated that the single yard they observed consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. He described the waste as magnificent, lights left burning in empty buildings and electric fans humming in vacant rooms, the careless behavior of a nation with seemingly endless resources. Crossing into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners saw American industry on a scale none had imagined. Factories stretched farther and stood larger than any in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum works in Tennessee ran for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces drawing some 175,000 kilowatts, more power than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains slowed beside the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had risen from open fields in just 18 months. 4 vast installations, each employing thousands, and together producing some 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber a year. Germany, though it had pioneered the process, had never produced more than about 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood the meaning at once. In a post-war interview, he recalled recognizing distillation columns and catalytic crackers he knew well, and realizing that each plant was more advanced than anything they had built, and that there were 4 of them clustered in a single location. They said there were dozens more like it, scattered across the nation, And as the train rolled by Ford's Willow Run outside Detroit, visible for miles, the captives learned this single facility had been raised in only 9 months and turned out a B-24 Liberator roughly every 63 minutes. At peak output, some 42,000 workers assembled airplanes from about 150,000 parts, provided by roughly 1,500 subcontractors, the plant occupying some 2.5 million square feet of floor space and drawing more power than the entire German city of Cologne. Hutman Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot downed in Tunisia, pressed his face to the glass and counted 17 B-24s at various stages of completion. We had been taught that American aircraft were flimsy and hastily made and would fall apart in combat. Yet the steadiness of the assembly lines and the workmanship told a different story. These were not inferior machines, only produced on a scale and at a speed we had never imagined. The farther inland the train went, the more thoroughly Nazi myths unraveled. In St. Louis, we crossed the Mississippi on the Eads Bridge and watched barges below carrying more grain than the whole German harvest of 1942, while grain elevators stretched along both banks, each holding stores enough to feed a German city for months. Carl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, noted in his diary that Americans moved food with the same casual abundance Germans reserved for ammunition. He described seeing a single barge loaded with enough wheat to feed his village for 5 years, while the crane operator munched a sandwich with more meat than they received in a week. In Kansas City, the train halted beside a vast stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited, and the stench of packing plants hung for miles. German prisoners who had scraped by on about 200 grams of meat per week in Africa watched American workers eating beef sandwiches at noon, and one wrote that they ate meat as if it were as common as the bread we longed for. A guard bought hamburgers. From a stand by the station, meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for a few cents, purchased 20 at a time with a single dollar as if it were nothing. This was not a treat, but everyday fare. Arrival at the camps delivered another blow to their assumptions. Camp Hearn in Texas, erected in roughly 4 months, held some 3,400 prisoners in conditions that outstripped what many had known. As civilians, wooden barracks lit by electricity, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat, each building fashioned with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The hospital amazed the medical officers among them. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found X-ray machines, modern surgical instruments, and pharmaceutical stocks that had been unavailable in Germany. Since 1941, and penicillin, that rumored miracle drug, was used freely, even for minor infections, while at home German soldiers were dying for lack of basic sulfa medicines. The kitchen became another lesson in plenty. Prisoners assigned to cook found walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automatic dishwashers, and gas ranges able to feed 5,000 men. Daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in amounts German civilians had not seen since 1939, and Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef, recorded weeping as he watched perfectly good loaves thrown away because regulations demanded preparing a 10% surplus to guarantee full portions for every man. By September 1943, agricultural labor shortages led to POWs being trucked to fields and factories across the heartland. Work details moved without blindfolds or secret routes, and the prisoners saw everything. Endless corn and wheat, factories. On 3 shifts, shops overflowing with goods, parking lots full of cars, homes with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Herbert Lang watched a single machine clean in 1 hour more cotton than his whole village could in a month by hand. The gin ran on electricity supplied by the Colorado River Authority as part of a rural electrification program that had reached roughly 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The owner was no noble or party official, Lang noted, just an ordinary farmer with electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including black laborers, ate boxed lunches containing more food than German workers received in a week, and every farm they passed looked much the same. In Nebraska, prisoners working sugar beet fields witnessed machines that replaced whole crews. A single combine did the work of 100 men in fields rolled to the horizon, each larger than many German counties, with yields the farmers treated as routine. 60 bushels to the acre, where Germany could only manage 30. On its best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, laboring near Scottsbluff, wrote that a farmer's 16-year-old son drove a tractor worth more than his father had earned in a lifetime, and when Hoffmann mentioned it, the boy laughed and said the machine was nothing special, and that a newer John Deere was on its way. Perhaps the most shattering revelations came to those assigned to factories. Although Geneva rules barred POWs from direct weapons work, they could be employed in industries that freed American workers for military production, a loophole that let thousands of German prisoners witness U.S. industrial power firsthand. At a Campbell's factory in New Jersey, they watched production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than many German plants managed in a month, run by a skeleton crew of women and older men, yet exceeding peacetime output. Stabsfeld-Weibel, Ernst Wagner, who had factory experience in Germany, described electric conveyors, automatic fillers, and steam cookers handling hundreds of cans at once, while a single elderly woman oversaw controls that would have required 50 workers back home, sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, POWs unloading coal at a power station glimpsed the automotive industry's conversion for war. Across the water, the River Rouge complex employed some 100,000 people producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks, and consumed roughly 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity a day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. And prisoners watched parking lots filled with workers' cars, a sight German men and even many officers rarely saw for themselves. By winter 1943, the accumulated effect of all these observations produced what U.S. intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education effort in the Provost Marshal General's office, recorded rising numbers requesting American newspapers, books, and educational material, and Major Paul Noland reported in December 1943 that prisoners no longer argued when shown production statistics that the most fanatical Nazis had fallen silent, and while loyalty to Germany often remained, talk of victory had diminished, and many openly questioned what they had been told about America. Camp newspapers produced by prisoners shifted too. Titles printed at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, for example, gradually moved from defiant nationalism toward debates about democracy, economic arrangements, and post-war rebuilding as editors chosen. For their anti-Nazi stance found a more receptive readership. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter intercepted by American censors that they had been told America was a mongrel, weak and divided land controlled by Jews and incapable of military strength. But every day he spent there convinced him of the opposite. This was the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth, and their previous beliefs had been nothing but stories spun by criminals. The severest blow to Nazi belief systems came from a source no one expected: the way Italian prisoners were handled after Italy surrendered in September 1943. Italians, who agreed to cooperate, were organized into service units, given superior billets, higher pay, and far more liberty. German captives watched former allies working side by side with Americans, dining in civilian restaurants, and even courting local women, and many recorded bitter surprise that men they had been told were traitors received humane treatment and opportunities to earn money and send parcels home. Headman Friedrich Schultz noted that the Italians seemed to be treated better than we had treated them as allies, and that the Republican freedoms Americans practiced appeared more honorable than their own system. Christmas 1943 inflicted another decisive shock. Civic groups, churches, and voluntary organizations sent 500,000 gift parcels to German prisoners, packs filled with cigarettes, sweets, toiletries, and games, while communities tried to include prisoners in seasonal celebrations, sending choir performances in German, homemade cakes from local women, Boy Scout cards, and offers of dinners even if regulations prevented most men from attending. Such unsolicited kindness shattered the last shards of Nazi racial doctrine. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, who had lost a brother in the Hamburg raids, wrote that, despite knowing Americans were fighting their sons and husbands, they were shown genuine Christian compassion rather than propaganda, a generosity that made him suspect only a nation utterly secure in its victory would behave this way. The Christmas meal itself, turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream in amounts Germany had not seen since before World War I, left men physically sick from overeating and mentally stunned that such abundance could be lavished on enemies. Feldwebel Hansa confessed they ate like kings, better than generals or party officials, and were told by guards that this was ordinary American fare, which implied their own soldiers must be fed even better. By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational offerings: English, U.S. history, mathematics, and the sciences, with correspondence courses from the University of Chicago and visiting lectures from Stanford professors. Prisoners who had been taught that Americans were uncultured barbarians found instead libraries filled with millions of books, universities open to all classes, and cutting-edge scientific work. They read multiple newspapers and compared viewpoints, something impossible under Nazi rule. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, later recalled attending atomic physics talks at Camp Shelby, where American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught without malice and treated science as a universal human endeavor, revealing research advances years ahead of German work and a willingness to share knowledge even with former enemies. Camp theaters screened ordinary Hollywood features, not propaganda, and films like Gone with the Wind and The Grapes of Wrath exposed prisoners to portrayals of American self-criticism and recovery. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer observed that Americans aired their faults openly, a transparency that strengthened rather than weakened them. Criticism in Germany would have meant death, but here it was a patriotic act. Spring 1944 brought expanded labor programs as U.S. production peaked. POWs worked in canneries, mills, and manufacturing plants where numerical scale told a story no slogan could refute. At the Higgins Boat Yard in New Orleans, prisoners handled steel destined for landing craft and watched a plant producing some 700 boats a month, each requiring roughly 20,000 parts and employing about 20,000 workers, women operating cranes, welding hulls, and running the lines, while Stabsfeld-Webel Kurt Zimmermann recorded disbelief at women, black workers, and teenagers performing complex industrial tasks continuously on 3 shifts around the clock. They built in a month more landing craft than Germany's Navy could in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, men saw daily outputs on the order of 10,000 tons of steel, blast furnaces fed by endless ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania, running non-stop, a scale that outstripped anything the Ruhr had achieved, and Oberwachtmeister Paul Hartmann admitted that the plant spilled more steel in waste than his old works had ever produced, with workers complaining about overtime while turning out quantities impossible even with forced labor. The summer 1944 harvest completed the refutation of claims about American agricultural weakness. POWs in the Midwest witnessed combines that harvested as much in a day as whole German villages could in weeks, single farms producing yields that dwarfed entire provinces back home, and grain elevators stocked with more wheat than Germany imported in a year. One East Prussian farmer recorded that a single American farmer with machines could do the work of 100 German farmers, and aerial photos of vast wheat belts showed thousands of square miles of grain that could lose half their yield and still outproduce all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards stretching to the horizon and watched perfectly good fruit discarded for minor blemishes or entire crops plowed under to support market prices. A brutality of abundance that reduced hungry Germans to anguish as mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits despite pleas to send them home. June 6, 1944, marked the final ideological collapse. News of the Normandy invasion, an armada of some 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first assault, revealed an organizational capacity the prisoners could not have imagined. Within days, camps screened newsreels showing the artificial harbors and a supply system that delivered some 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. And men realized their homeland was being broken by the nation they had been taught was too weak to fight. Friedrich von Tauben later wrote that at that moment, they understood that not only the war, but the entire Nazi enterprise had failed, that they had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with myths and racial dogma, sending horses against trucks and rifles against automatic weapons. Above all, the humane treatment they experienced undermined propaganda more than material plenty. Americans separated the German populace from the Nazi regime through gestures of mercy, camp commanders delivering Red Cross condolences to grieving families, church groups sending food to the wives and children of prisoners in Germany, actions that proved the claim, "We fight Hitler, not Germans," was sincere, and that the victors intended to rebuild rather than raise. Medical care made a particular impression. German physicians worked alongside American staff in well-equipped hospitals receiving X-rays, modern surgical tools, and penicillin that had been scarce at home, and mental health support, counseling, for suicidality and therapy for breakdowns, replaced punishment, demonstrating a confidence and moral strength foreign to Nazi conditioning. By March 1945, the secret re-education effort in the Provost Marshal's office had produced striking outcomes. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp papers published pieces on constitutional government, markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's post-war future, and men who had arrived as ardent Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler began planning how to import American agricultural methods back home. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Ost Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarshal, in a 1975 interview, and he emphasized that conversion came not through coercion, but through direct observation. They saw ordinary people, living better than German aristocrats. They witnessed systems that worked, and they wanted those results for Germany. The change was so sweeping that American officials grew concerned the prisoners had become overly enamored with life in the United States. Some asked to remain after the war. A number married women they had met through correspondence programs, and thousands would eventually emigrate to America in the 1950s. In April 1945, the final shock arrived, as U.S. troops liberated Nazi concentration camps and the grisly images were shown to German POWs. Many at first dismissed the reports as fabrications, but mounting evidence, from eyewitness testimony by American soldiers to photographs, newsreels, and later letters from home, made denial impossible and produced a collapse of moral certainty. Men who had clung to a sense of national honor despite military defeat now confronted the fact that what they had fought for was not merely lost, but morally rotten. As headman Walter Schmidt later summed up, those who had believed themselves champions of a noble cause discovered they had been instruments of criminals, taught to believe they were civilizing others while in truth behaving as the barbarians. And the Americans they had scorned as weak and decadent had shown them the true meaning of civilization. When the war ended in May 1945, German POWs faced repatriation with complicated feelings. They had seen an America that contradicted every lie they had learned, eaten better as captives than as soldiers, and been accorded more dignity by foes than by their own government. Their final months in custody were spent preparing for return to a shattered homeland. U.S. authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction, and prisoners were briefed on plans for rebuilding, understanding even before it was officially announced that Americans intended reconstruction, not retribution. "They prepared us to rebuild our country," wrote Ost Friedrich von Tobin. "The occupiers taught skills, imparted knowledge, and offered hope, transforming defeated fighters into prospective citizens." Between 1945 and 1946, some 371,683 German POWs were sent home from American camps, arriving in a divided, devastated Germany, but carrying with them an invaluable asset: first-hand knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. Many of these former prisoners became engines of post-war change, bringing American techniques to German factories, efficiency to agriculture, and democratic ideas into politics, so that in the 1950s, West Germany's economic revival owed in part to lessons learned behind U.S. barbed wire. Figures such as Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby and later West German ambassador to the United States, Walter Hallstein, who taught at a camp and became a European Commission president, Rüdiger von Marr, once at Camp Herne and later a permanent representative to the United Nations, and Edward Ackerman, a Fort Robinson prisoner who led agricultural reform, exemplified how captivity produced people who transplanted American methods back home. The central lesson many carried was simple: prosperity springs from freedom, not conquest. Democracy produced wealth, diversity strengthened society, and humane treatment of workers boosted output. Historians have hailed the German POW experience in America as among the most effective re-education efforts ever undertaken. Without coercion or crude propaganda, exposure to American industry and civic life converted hardened Nazis into citizens of a democracy. The program's power lay in what prisoners could see, touch, and taste. Every hot meal, every electric light, every flushing toilet argued against Nazi doctrine. The statistics underline the scale and effectiveness. Over 500 camps were established across 45 states. Only Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont were unlisted, including 175 principal camps with some 325 branches, each facility constructed in roughly 90 days on average to house between 250 and 12,000 inmates. The prisoner population numbered 371,683 German POWs out of about 425,171 Axis POWs in U.S. custody, peaking in May 1945, with monthly arrivals averaging 20,000 in 1943, rising to 30,000 after D-Day and reaching 60,000 in the war's final months. POW labor contributed some 14 million man-days in agriculture, processed 100 million board feet of lumber, and represented roughly $230 million in labor value at then-prevailing wages. Prisoners earned about 80 cents a day in the 1940s, and filled critical shortages in 46 states. Escape attempts were vanishingly rare. Only 2,222 attempts were recorded among more than 371,000 prisoners, about 0.6%, with no permanent successful escapes and most runaways recaptured within a day. No American civilians were harmed by escapees. Education and reintegration programs were extensive. More than 40,000 POWs enrolled in courses. 135 camp newspapers were published by prisoners. Some 30,000 took English classes. 15,000 trained in trades and 8,000 engaged in university correspondence study. Roughly 5,000 former POWs emigrated to the U.S. after the war. Over 12,000 maintained long-term correspondence with American families, an average exchange lasting 31 years, and many returned as visitors or business partners. Surveys showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% said captivity had positively changed their outlook. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy, and fewer than 10% clung to firm Nazi beliefs by 1945. These numbers mirror the human stories. In 1985, some 500 surviving former prisoners returned to Austin, Texas, for a reunion where men like former Oberleutnant Hans Wehe, who had trained as a physician after returning to the United States, recalled how camp life, running water, central heating, plentiful food, had restored dignity to men who had known only hardship in Germany, and others told how Midwestern farmers treated them as young men far from home, sharing meals and homes in ways that changed them forever. At that reunion, oboist Herman Gutz declared that they had arrived in America as enemies and believers in a lie, and left as friends, and Democrats convinced that strength roots in production, diversity, and freedom, rather than conquest and hatred. The German POW story in America demonstrates that one of the most potent instruments of victory can be demonstration rather than destruction. The visceral evidence of a free society's ability to create abundance converted captives into advocates for Reconstruction, sowing seeds that would sprout into the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan's spirit, and West Germany's democratic rebirth. What began when veterans of the Africa Corps disembarked in Mexia, Texas in June 1943 ended with men returning home as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy rather than as unrepentant conquerors. Their conversion helped lay the groundwork for postwar recovery, proving that the greatest weapon a society can wield is the living